At 58, after 31 years of marriage, Delia Foss drove out of Calhoun County with a garbage bag of clothes, a rusted Dodge pickup, and a folded deed to her father's gas station on a gravel county road in the Ozarks. Ray kept the house, the savings account, the investment portfolio, and everything else his lawyers bothered to write down. The station had been closed since Clem Broussard died 4 years back. His compass still sat on the back shelf where he'd left it. Delia had come to empty the place and put it on the market. But when she pried up the hearthstone in the back room and found the cedar box her father had sealed underneath it, she found something Clem had spent 44 years quietly building. Something the whole River Valley still talked about, even if his own daughter had never been told. Ray Foss had a way of filling a room without saying much. He'd stand in doorways with his hands in his pockets and his eyes already somewhere else, and the message would arrive without him needing to deliver it. "You're handled. Don't worry about it. I've thought about this so you don't have to." He said these things with a look, not a sentence, and Delia had spent 3 decades learning to read him fluently. She had also spent 3 decades being fluent in a language that only worked in one direction. The hearing was on a Tuesday in October, in a courtroom that smelled like forced air and old carpet. Ray sat beside his attorney at the respondent's table in a gray suit he'd had for 15 years, because he believed in wearing good things until they were finished. His attorney was a man named Shelby who had the brisk confidence of someone who spent most of his time across the table from people who weren't prepared. Delia's attorney was a woman in her 40s named Patterson, who had taken her case for a reduced rate because Delia had no money and a case that was simple on paper. Simple on paper was the phrase Patterson used. Delia turned it over during the hearing the way you turned over a stone, looking for what lived underneath. The settlement terms were read aloud. The house in Springfield, the retirement accounts, the mutual fund portfolio, the 2021 Lexus, all to Ray. The 2012 Dodge pickup with 190,000 miles, Delia's personal effects, the savings account currently holding $847, and the real property at Route C, Loren County, Missouri, to Delia. The Route C property was what Ray's attorney had called it during the asset evaluation. Real property, unimproved, market value approximately $18,500 per independent appraisal. Nobody had told Ray to let Delia keep it. His lawyers had looked at the number and moved on. Delia signed. 4 places, 2 initials. The marriage was a stack of documents. She picked up the box from under the table, cardboard, the medium kind, the kind you got from a grocery store produce section. Ray had left it on the kitchen counter for her to collect. Inside, a jewelry box her mother had left her. A photo album from when the kids were small. A coffee mug her father had given her that said "Best Daughter" on the side, except someone had put it through the dishwasher too many times, and the lettering had faded to half its words, so it just said "Best Now." She put the box in the passenger seat of the Dodge and sat in the courthouse parking lot for a while. She had nowhere particular to go. Ray's house, the house she'd lived in for 19 years, was Ray's now in a way that the paperwork just confirmed. She had one daughter in Atlanta who sent money when she had it, and worry all the time. She had $847.00 and a property she hadn't seen since her father's funeral. She pulled the deed from the folder Patterson had left her. The paper was stiff and creased. Broussard Gas and Tires, Route C, Loren County, Missouri, deeded to Delia Ann Foss, formerly Broussard, sole heir and surviving next of kin per the last will and testament of Clement Francis Broussard, deceased. She'd known the station would come to her when Clem died. She hadn't done anything about it. Ray said the taxes were barely worth paying and the building was past its useful life. She'd paid the taxes because Clem would have expected her to, and let the rest of it sit. It was a 3-hour drive from Springfield down into the Ozarks. The interstate gave way to state highway, which gave way to county road, which eventually gave way to Route C, a gravel road that ran along the edge of the river bottoms where the cedars grew thick and the sweet gum trees were just starting to go red at the edges. The road dipped and curved through land that hadn't changed much since Clem drove it every morning for 44 years. Delia remembered the smell before she remembered anything else. Cedar and river mud and the faint iron tang of the gravel dust. She'd spent summers here as a girl, July and August when her mother worked second shift at the hospital and there was nobody else to watch her. Clem had taught her to read a gauge, check a battery, thread a valve core. He'd taught her the name of every tool on his pegboard and why you put it back in the same spot every time. She hadn't touched a wrench since the year she married Ray. The station appeared around a bend in the road, smaller than memory, the way places always were. A low cinder block building, long and flat, with a covered pump island out front where the pump stood rusted and locked. The price displays had frozen on numbers from 8 years ago. Honeysuckle had gone up the east wall and was reaching for the corner of the roof. The sign above the door, Broussard Gassin Tires, had been hand-painted by Clem himself, and was now a ghost of its lettering, readable if you knew what it said. The door was locked. She used the key from the deed folder. The lock was stiff, then gave. Inside, the air was heavy and still. Late afternoon light came through the grime on the windows, laying pale squares across the concrete floor. A wooden counter ran along the back wall, and behind it, a pegboard with empty hooks and the shadow outlines of tools long since put away. The register, a mechanical one with big round keys, sat at the end of the counter with its drawer cracked open. And on the back shelf, between a bottle of starting fluid and a box of shop rags, sat Clem's army compass. Brass, domed, worn smooth on the case from being handled for decades. Still pointing north. Beside it, folded open to the puzzle page, a word search from a newspaper that had yellowed to the color of old butter. Clem had worked through most of the grid in pencil. One word still circled in the bottom corner, not yet crossed off the list. And beside that, on the ledge where Clem used to rest his coffee while he worked the counter, a tin mug, handle worn shiny. The letters faded almost to nothing, but Delia knew what they said because she'd painted them herself with a craft kit when she was 9 years old. World's Best Pop. She stood there holding the mug for a long time. The dust on the outside came off on her fingers, and the tin was cold. She cleaned it with the hem of her shirt. She set it back where it was. There was a repair bay through the door on the south wall, 2 lifts, a compressor, a pegboard covered with Clem's tools outlined in black marker so you'd know at a glance if something was missing. Everything was there. 44 years of accumulated hand tools, organized the way Clem organized everything, by function, by size, by the logic of a man who believed that a place for everything was not a saying but a principle. There was an apartment above the main room, a narrow staircase in the back. One room with a bed frame and a mattress that had been covered with a plastic tarp before Clem died. A kitchen with a 2-burner stove. A bathroom with a cracked mirror and a bar of soap still in its wrapper. Delia sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the window above the bed. Through it, the ridge line across the river bottom. The last light going orange on the cedar tops. She was 58 years old. She had $847 and a mug she'd given her father when she was a child, and a building that had been appraised at $1,800 by a man who drove past it without stopping. She didn't feel like crying. The crying had come earlier, alone in the guest room of Ray's house when she'd finally understood that the life she was living had stopped being hers a long time ago. And the ending was just the paperwork. What she felt now was quieter, emptier, the particular quiet of a woman who had run out of the noise she'd been using to fill the days. She went back downstairs as the light failed. The station felt different in the dark, less abandoned and more waiting, the way a room felt when someone had just stepped out of it and hadn't gone far. She walked behind the counter and ran her hand along the wall beneath the register. Clem had built the counter himself in the early 70s from mill lumber he'd gotten cheap from a man who owed him a favor. Her fingers found a seam, not a crack. A seam, straight, deliberate, cut with a saw. She knelt down. The panel was about 2 feet square, fitted flush against the wall. No screws, no nails. She worked her fingers into the seam and pulled. The panel came away clean, revealing a shallow space in the wall. Inside was a cedar box, the kind that used to hold cigars but had been enlarged, fitted with a lid, sealed with a strip of black electrical tape around the edge. Next to it, a roll of craft paper tied with kitchen twine. Delia lifted the cedar box and carried it to the counter. She peeled the tape away carefully. Inside, a ledger, cloth-covered, green, thick as a dictionary. A bundle of photograph envelopes. A hand-cut folded piece of paper on top of everything. Unaddressed, she opened the ledger first. Clem's handwriting, small, compressed, steady. The handwriting of a man who'd learned to write in an army tent and never changed his hand. The first entry was dated March of 1969. Floyd Hensley, alternator, family can't make rent. Told him $30, charged him $0. Noted it here. He'll pay when he can. He won't be able to. She turned the page. Addie Corbin transmission job. 3 kids, husband left in November. Charged parts only. Told her the labor was on me because I had a slow week. I didn't have a slow week. She kept reading. Page after page, entry after entry, spanning 5 decades. Names she recognized from her childhood. Hensley, Corbin, Ledbetter, Tate, Greer, and names she didn't know. Amounts small and large. Free repairs. Forgiven debts. Bags of groceries left in unlocked vehicles. A water pump for the Dorsey family installed on a Sunday billed as $20 for parts. A fuel fill-up for a man broken down with his wife and 2 kids on Route C in January. Noted as no charge, roadside assistance. They had nothing. Delia read until the last of the light failed, then took the ledger upstairs to the apartment, plugged in the lamp by the bed, and kept reading. 4 hours. She didn't notice. The photograph envelopes were the kind that came back from the drugstore. Those flat paper packets with the prints inside. Dozens of them. People's faces she didn't recognize, standing in front of their trucks, or their houses, or their repaired farm equipment, or in front of this building. Smiling. Every person in every photograph, smiling. She found the note at the bottom of the cedar box when she'd taken everything else out. It was a single folded piece of paper, written in Clem's compressed hand, undated. If anybody finds this, it's just an accounting. I kept track because I believe a man ought to know what he spent himself on. Not money. Himself? These are the people I spent myself on, and I don't regret $1 or an hour. That was it. No name, no date, no further explanation. Delia set it on the nightstand beside the compass she'd carried upstairs. She lay on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. The lamp threw a yellow circle on the plaster. Outside, the river-bottom frogs had started up, and the sound of them came through the window screen in a steady wave. She thought about the accounting. 44 years of it. A man behind a counter on a county road in the Ozarks, running a station that barely made enough to keep the lights on. Quietly spending himself on other people without calling it generosity or service or faith. Just calling it an accounting. She reached over and turned off the lamp. She wasn't going to sell this place. The thought arrived like something true, the way true things do, without announcement, without argument, already decided before you put words to it. She lay in the dark listening to the frogs and the cedar trees moving in the river wind and the particular deep quiet of an Ozarks October night. And she let herself understand what it meant to be Earl Macklin's, what it meant to be Clem Broussard's daughter, in this building, holding a ledger that proved a life. Morning came in gray and cool. River mist lay in the bottom land and the cedars stood in it like suggestions. Delia made coffee on the 2-burner stove with the last of a can she found in the cabinet and carried the mug downstairs. She walked the repair bay first. The compressor still pressurized. The lifts were seized but not beyond repair. Every tool was on its hook. Clem had run a clean shop and a clean shop lasted. She was testing the compressor when a pickup slowed on Route C and pulled onto the gravel. A woman climbed out, maybe 70, broad and steady, wearing a down vest over a flannel shirt and carrying a Tupperware container that steamed at the corners. She walked up to where Delia stood in the bay door and looked at her for a moment. "You look just like him," the woman said. "Same eyes, same jaw." "Norma Tate," Delia said. She'd heard the name from Clem, the postmistress down the road, since 1981. Norma held up the Tupperware. "I made biscuits this morning." Made too many on purpose. She looked past Delia at the repair bay. "Bay looks good." "I worried he'd left a mess. He left everything organized." That was Clem. Norma came inside and set the biscuits on the workbench. "My husband Vern is in that ledger, I imagine. Alternator in 1974. Wouldn't hear of being paid. Vern tried to give him a ham. Did he take it? Said he didn't eat ham. He ate ham every Thursday." Norma picked up a wrench from the pegboard, looked at the outline beneath it, put it back exactly right. He just didn't want Vern to feel beholden. Delia opened the Tupperware. The biscuits were still warm. "They're going to come," Norma said. She wasn't being ominous. It was more like reporting something she'd already calculated. When word gets around you're here, people are going to come. Clem helped a lot of families on this road. They'll want to do something with that. How does word get around? "I just arrived." Norma smiled, "A small thing at the corners. You stopped for gas on Highway 60 coming through. Doris at the register has a sister who lives 4 miles from here. That was 3 hours ago. She picked up a biscuit. Word got around." They ate standing in the bay with coffee that was too strong and too old and satisfying anyway. Tell me things he didn't tell me, Delia said. Norma thought. He was proud of you. Not the quiet proud men think is the normal kind. Genuinely proud. He kept a photo of you on the counter for decades. Every person who came in, he found a way to work your name into the conversation. She paused. He worried about you too. Said you'd married a man who thought money was the same as value. He told you that? He told me while he was changing my wiper blades for free and pretending he'd already been paid. Clem talked more when his hands were busy. 2 vehicles passed on Route C while they were in the bay. Both slowed at the sight of the Dodge pickup. One driver waved, 2 fingers off the wheel, the Ozarks greeting. The one that said I see you without making a production of it. Delia raised 2 fingers back. Before Norma left, she said, "The furnace. Clem told me once there was something in the furnace room. Never said what. Just said if the time was right, someone would find it." She looked at Delia steadily. "I always assumed that meant you." That afternoon, 3 carloads arrived at the station. A couple in their 60s with a pot of beans and a bottle of propane. An older man, a retired farmer, who left a load of split firewood against the building wall and waved off thanks through his truck window. A woman who brought her teenage daughter and stood in the bay door while the girl looked at Clem's tools and didn't touch anything without asking. Each one said something. Different words, the same meaning. He helped us once. A man named Gilbert arrived last, at dusk. He drove a farm truck that was older than he was, climbed out stiffly, and walked to the bay where Delia was testing the lift mechanism. He watched her for a while without speaking, which was its own kind of Ozarks courtesy. "Your daddy fixed my tractor in 2001, he said. Engine seized. I was facing harvest with a field full of corn and nothing to pull with. He took off his cap and held it. He worked on it 2 days. Charged me for the parts. I asked how much for the labor and he said he didn't charge for 2-day jobs because they meant he liked the challenge. He looked down at the cap. Came up 22,000 bushels that year. Best harvest I ever had." Delia stopped cranking the lift. "You drove out to tell me that." "Drove out because this station being open again matters." He put his cap back on. It always mattered. Some things fill a gap other things can't fill. He drove away before she could offer him coffee. That night, Delia ate beans from the pot and read more of the ledger. When she got to the 1990s, the entries started to have a quality she hadn't noticed earlier. Names were repeated. Not the same problem, but the same people. Clem had kept up with them. A note from 1971 about a family's bad heating season would have a follow-up in 1982 when the daughter graduated school, and another in 1994 when the grandson was born. He'd tracked them, not their debts, their lives. He'd marked when things got better. That was what struck her the most. He cared whether it got better. He wasn't doing it to be owed or to feel generous. He was doing it the way you'd tend a garden, because you wanted to see what grew. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Delia arrived, the station was open. Not announced. Not officially licensed yet, because the paperwork was a process. But when a man rolled up with a grinding brake sound that she recognized at 20 yards, she waved him in. An hour later, he drove away with new pads and a bill for parts only. Jesse had gone to school. Marcus hadn't arrived yet. Norma was there. Word traveled. By the end of the first week, 2 vehicles a day were pulling in. By the end of the second week, 4, Delia was working the bay herself and the counter herself and making coffee herself, and she was tired in a way she hadn't been in years. Deeply, satisfyingly tired. The kind that came from using yourself for something that mattered. Norma. Norma had recruited 2 men from down the road who owed Clem favors to come help with the roof, which had a slow leak over the stockroom. They arrived on a Thursday with ladders and shingles and finished the job in a day without asking for anything. One of them, a man named Daryl, said his mother was in Clem's ledger from 1983. She talked about him her whole life, Daryl said from the roof. Said he was the most quietly decent person she ever met. What did he do for her? Daryl nailed a shingle. Fixed her car, told her it was covered under some warranty he made up on the spot. She knew. She didn't argue. Another nail. She said the kindness wasn't in the fix. It was in the way he let her keep her dignity. The setback came on a Thursday at the end of October. A white truck pulled in. Not a local. The plates were from Jefferson City. And a man in a pressed button down climbed out. He walked with the purposeful stride of someone who'd driven to deliver something and wanted it done efficiently. He introduced himself as a land acquisition consultant for a company called Meridian Pipeline Partners. He had an envelope. "We've been trying to reach the family of Clement Broussard for 18 months, he said. "We're acquiring a right-of-way corridor through this section of the county for a natural gas transmission line. The Route C property sits directly within the proposed easement. Under Missouri eminent domain statutes, if voluntary purchase can't be reached, the company has the right to proceed with condemnation." He held out the envelope. Delia didn't take it immediately. She looked at him. He was maybe 40, with the practiced neutral face of someone who delivered news like this regularly and had learned to give it no more weight than he could afford. "What's the offer?" she said. "The independent appraisal puts the Route C property at $147,000 fair market value, accounting for the easement impact." Delia took the envelope. She opened it and read the first page. "My ex-husband's attorneys will see this," she said. The man blinked. "I'm not sure the settlement that gave me this property. My ex-husband's team appraised it at $18,500. If it's worth $147,000, he'll file a motion to reopen the settlement and claim his share." She folded the letter. "So this letter doesn't just threaten my property. It threatens my right to keep it at all." The man from Meridian looked uncomfortable for the first time. "That's a private legal matter. I can't." "I know it is." Delia handed the envelope back. "I need some time. Come back in 2 weeks." She went inside and called Patterson from the courthouse. Patterson listened without interrupting. Then she said, "He's right about the eminent domain statute. The pipeline company has a legitimate path to condemnation. But that process takes months, sometimes years, and you can fight the valuation." "What about Ray's attorneys?" A pause. "If the property is worth $147,000 and it was appraised at $18,500 during the divorce, they can argue it was misrepresented. Not necessarily by you intentionally. The appraisal was theirs. But they can argue the settlement should be revisited. Can they win? They can try. It depends on whether the property was ever part of the marital estate." "Was it?" "My father left it to me. It was never in both our names. That helps. But Ray's team will argue the value increase should be shared." Patterson was quiet for a moment. "We need to understand the property's exact legal status. I'm going to look at the chain of title and the trust documents, if there are any." Delia hung up and sat behind the counter. The compass was on the shelf. The word search was folded open to the puzzle page. The tin mug held 2 pencils and a tire gauge. She picked up the ledger. Norma had mentioned the furnace room, said Clem had told her something was there. Delia went to the back of the station, past the stockroom, to the small utility room where the furnace stood. The furnace itself was old, oil-fired. The kind that would have been replaced twice in a newer building. Clem had maintained it himself. The room smelled like rust and heat. She looked at the walls. Cinder block on 3 sides, a wood-paneled wall on the 4th, which had always been a little odd for a utility room. She pressed her hand against the panels. One section moved. Not much, a 1/4 inch, but it moved. She looked along the seam and found the edge, the same kind of flush-fitted panel as the one behind the register. She worked her fingers in and pulled. Behind the panel was a narrow space between the false wall and the foundation block. On a wooden shelf inside the space sat a metal document tube, the kind used for rolled blueprints or legal papers, sealed with a threaded cap. Her name was written on a strip of masking tape on the outside, in Clem's handwriting. "Delia." She carried it to the counter. The cap was tight. She used the back of a spoon from the apartment kitchen to crack the seal. Inside, a roll of papers, legal size, tied with a ribbon that had faded from red to pink. She unrolled them under the counter lamp. The first page was a trust document, dated 22 years ago, filed with the Loren County Recorder's Office, stamp and all, seal intact. The Clement F. Broussard Family Trust, irrevocable. The trust named Clem as trustee during his lifetime, and Delia, listed by her birth name, Delia Ann Broussard, as the sole remainder beneficiary upon his death. The trust held one asset, the Route C property. Delia read it twice, then a third time. 22 years ago, her father had put this property in an irrevocable trust with her name on it. Not a will, a trust. Which meant the property had never passed through probate at the time of Clem's death. It had transferred automatically, by the terms of the trust, to Delia, which meant it had never been part of any estate subject to court oversight. which meant it had never been part of any marital asset pool, regardless of when the marriage ended or what it was worth. Below the trust document was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten on yellow legal paper in Clem's hand. Delia, I've been meaning to write this down for 20 years and kept putting it off the way you put off things that matter because they take more courage than the things that don't. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I hope it's not too soon. I hope you've had time to know me the way I've wanted you to know me, not as the man who pumped gas and handed you an oily wrench when you were 9, but as the man who watched you grow up and was afraid he couldn't tell you what he wanted you to know. So I'm writing it. This station will be yours. Not because you asked for it or because there's nobody else, but because I've watched you your whole life and I know what you're built of. You're built of the same thing your grandmother was built of. The thing that makes a person stay and do the work when everyone else has moved on to something easier. I saw it in you when you were a girl. I see it in the way you talk about the children you raised and the life you tried to build. You stayed longer than you should have in places that didn't deserve you. That's not weakness. That's the cost of being someone who takes keeping promises seriously. I set up the trust 22 years ago because Ray Foss came out here once and looked at this station the way certain men look at things they're assessing for disposal. He was polite about it. He always was. But I could see what was in his face, and what was in his face was a man who counted what things cost, and not what they were worth. I didn't trust him with the things that mattered. So I made sure this one was out of reach before it needed to be. I don't have much money. You know that. But I have this, and I kept it the way the families in my ledger kept what they had, by paying attention, by maintaining it, by refusing to let anyone tell me it wasn't worth something. The ledger is in the cedar box behind the counter. I want you to read it. Not because I want credit. Because I want you to understand what this station was for. It wasn't for the money. It was a way to be useful. And usefulness is its own kind of wealth, the only kind I know how to respect. You can sell the place if you need to. I won't fault you for it. But I think if you come out here and stand in the bay and put your hands on these tools, you'll find something I left for you that isn't in the ledger or the trust documents. You'll find out what you're made of. I always knew. I just wanted you to find out too. Your pop Delia folded the letter along its original creases and held it against her chest. The way she'd held the tin mug the first night. The way you held things that belonged to someone who couldn't be held anymore. Outside, the river bottom was quiet. The last of the October light came through the door she'd left open, gold and long and parallel to the ground. The compass on the shelf caught it and threw a small reflection on the ceiling. She set the trust document and the letter on the counter and called Patterson. Patterson picked up on the second ring. I found something, Delia said. She read the trust's key terms aloud. Patterson went quiet in the particular way of a lawyer who is working through something fast. When Delia finished, Patterson said, "Say that again." The filing date. 22 years ago. Patterson made a sound that was almost a laugh. Filed with the county recorder before the marriage broke down. Before any divorce proceedings. Before the property was ever evaluated. That's right. This changes everything. Patterson's voice had an edge to it now. An irrevocable trust filed and recorded creates a property interest that exists independently of the grantor's estate. When your father died, the property transferred to you automatically by operation of the trust. It never passed through probate. It was never part of an estate. And it was never part of any marital asset pool. Because it was already yours in law, held in trust before any divorce action began. What does that mean for Ray's motion? Patterson was quiet for another moment. It means his lawyers filed a motion to reopen a settlement over a property that was never subject to the settlement in the first place. The asset was in trust. It was never valuable as a marital asset regardless of its market value. And the pipeline? That's separate. But a trust beneficiary has full rights to contest eminent domain. You're not selling under duress. You have legal standing to push back. Delia looked at the trust document on the counter. At the compass on the shelf. How do we do it? She asked. We file the trust document with the court. Patterson paused. And we let Ray's lawyers explain to a judge why they spent 6 weeks trying to claim an asset that legally hasn't been Ray's for 22 years. Take a breath. What comes next is the part that stayed with me. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because this story goes further than you think. The hearing was 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, in the same county courthouse where the divorce had been finalized 7 months before. Ray sat beside Shelby at the respondent's table. He wore the gray suit again. His hands were flat on the table. He did not look at Delia. Patterson set the trust document on the table in front of the bench and walked through it in the precise, unhurried way of someone who knows they have all the time they need. The Route C property was placed in an irrevocable family trust 22 years ago, Patterson said, and filed with the Loran County Recorder's Office in the ordinary course. The trust designated Clement Broussard as trustee during his lifetime and Miss Foss as the sole remainder beneficiary. Upon Mr. Broussard's death 4 years ago, the property transferred automatically by operation of the trust. It was never subject to probate, it never formed part of the decedent's estate, and it was at no point a marital asset because it was already Miss Foss's in-law, held in trust for her benefit, before any proceedings in this matter began. The judge looked at the document. He looked at Shelby. Shelby said something about fair market value and equitable principles. The judge listened with the expression of a man who had heard this argument before. The trust is valid and recorded, the judge said. The property was never a marital asset. The motion to reopen is denied. Ray sat very still while Shelby gathered his papers. Outside, in the cold November parking lot, Patterson shook Delia's hand and said, "He set that up for you 22 years ago." He knew. He always knew, Delia said. The pipeline matter resolved the week before Thanksgiving. The land acquisition consultant, the man in the pressed button down, had come back with a revised offer and a harder tone. Delia had told him she was contesting and that her attorney was filing a formal objection to the easement route. He'd said his company's legal team would be in touch. They hadn't been. What came instead was a phone call from Norma, who had a particular tone for news that surprised even her. "You know that fellow from the pipeline company?" Norma said. "Pressed shirt, Jeff City plates?" Delia said she knew him. "His name is Toby Ledbetter." Norma paused. "His father is in your daddy's ledger." Delia went still. "I went back through it last week when you let me read some of it," Norma said. 1987. Carl Ledbetter. Family farm, risk of foreclosure. Your father lent him $1,400 and refused repayment until Carl had 2 good harvests. Carl paid it back in full in 1990. That's Toby's father? Carl's son, yes. Grew up on that farm. Went to college on a scholarship, got into land development. He doesn't know who his father's lender was. Carl died in 2003. Delia called Patterson. Patterson called the pipeline company's legal team. She cited the conflict of interest, an acquisition agent whose family farm was saved by the target property's owner, and asked that the case be reassigned. Toby Ledbetter came to the station the following Saturday. He drove a company truck and parked it at the edge of the lot, away from the pumps, as if he wasn't sure whether he had a right to be closer. He walked to the bay door where Delia was changing oil on Gilbert's farm truck. His name was the same as it had been on the acquisition letter. But he looked different than he'd looked that first day. Less pressed. Something in his face that hadn't been there before. "I found out about my father," he said. He stood in the bay door with his hands at his sides. "I didn't know the lender's name. My father never told me." "I figured that," Delia said. She capped the oil fill and wiped the funnel. He looked at the pegboard. At Clem's tools and their outlines. "I've been with Meridian 4 years," he said. "I've handled a lot of acquisitions." He was quiet for a moment. "I never thought about what I was asking people to give up." Delia looked at him. "This station," he said, "isn't worth the right-of-way to them. There are 2 other routes through the corridor. I've already filed a recommendation to reroute." His voice was flat and factual, the tone of someone reporting what happened rather than asking for credit. "They'll follow it." Delia set the funnel on the workbench. "Your father paid it back," she said. "I looked. Every cent, plus he sent a note." Toby nodded. He pressed his lips together. "I know. I found the letter in my mother's things after she passed. I just didn't know who sent the money." He looked at the compass on the shelf. "Do you know what happened to the man who helped him?" "He died 4 years ago." Delia said. "Right here." Toby looked at the station for a long moment. Then he walked back to the company truck and drove off. The reroute was confirmed 2 weeks later in a letter from Meridian's legal team. The Route C corridor was removed from the acquisition plan. Patterson called to tell her. Delia was behind the counter when she got the news, and Norma was across from her with a coffee mug and a word search, and through the bay door she could see Marcus changing his first tire alone without asking anyone for help. Marcus had arrived on a Tuesday on the afternoon bus from Poplar Bluff. He'd walked down Route C carrying a cardboard suitcase, wearing work boots that were too big for him and a canvas jacket that was too thin for November. He was 19 and had the look of someone who'd been heading somewhere specific and was trying to determine if this was it. He'd stood at the station door and looked in. Delia had been behind the counter reading the ledger. "Do you need someone?" he asked. "What can you do?" He thought about it. "Most things you need done. And what I can't do, I can learn fast." "You have a place to stay?" He looked at the floor. "No, the back room has a cot. Bathroom down the hall." Delia had closed the ledger. "I'll pay what I can until it gets better. It'll get better." He hadn't asked why she was offering. She hadn't explained. He'd carried his cardboard suitcase inside and put it next to the cot and gone straight to the bay to look at what needed doing. That was 6 weeks ago. He worked with the particular hunger of a person who'd been waiting a long time for a place to be useful. He asked good questions. He returned every tool to its outline the first time Delia showed him the system, and never had to be told again. He started staying after the station closed, sitting at the counter with a notebook and a mechanical repair manual from Clem's bookshelf. Studying, Delia recognized it. She'd seen it in the bay 50 years ago, in herself. The days found their rhythm. Delia woke early and went downstairs and made coffee, and the first car usually came before 7. Norma arrived mid-morning with something in a container and something to say, and usually both were worth having. Marcus worked the bay with a focus that surprised the older customers and earned their trust faster than his age should have allowed. Word had traveled that Broussard's was open again. Not advertising, not a sign campaign, just the way word traveled on a county road. 2 fingers off the wheel and a mention at the hardware store. They came for gas and stayed for the porch. Delia learned their names the way her father had. Learned who was struggling with what and how to address it without making it a transaction. A woman whose truck needed a brake job Delia knew she couldn't afford, and the bill when she came to collect showed parts only. A retired teacher who drove 40 minutes because he said honest work was worth the drive. An elderly couple who came every other week to sit on the 2 chairs Norma had left on the porch and watch the road and call it an outing. She kept track in a notebook, not the way Clem had, but her own version. Not an accounting of what was spent, an accounting of what was there. Norma left at noon with a promise to return on Thursday and a list of names she'd written on the back of a receipt. Families in the valley she said would want to know the station was open. Families who'd been driving 40 minutes out of their way for gas since Clem closed up. Delia looked at the list. 15 families. 15 families within 10 miles of this station who'd adjusted their routes for 4 years because the station was closed. She put the list in the ledger. The afternoon was quiet and she used it. She swept the bay floor and organized the back shelves of the stockroom and found, behind a row of oil cans, a box of emergency kits, flares, reflective triangles, first aid. The kind of thing Clem had kept for customers who came in distressed. They were 12 years old and still sealed. She found 2 winter coats in a garbage bag in the stockroom corner with a note in Clem's handwriting. Dorsey kids if their mother comes in and they look cold. She didn't know who the Dorsey kids were. She checked the ledger. The Dorsey family had an entry from 2009. Single mother, 3 children, heater gone out. Clem had paid for the repair himself and noted the children's sizes in case he needed to address outerwear needs. The handwriting beside the note said, checked on them in October. He checked on them in October, 11 years ago, to see if the kids needed coats. She put the garbage bag back where she'd found it. The following week, a woman named Rhonda came in for an oil change. She was in her 40s, worked at the school in town, drove an old Subaru that needed its air filter changed at minimum. Delia did the oil change and the filter and Rhonda paid and stood by the counter while Delia wrote out the receipt. "I always meant to come out and check on this place," Rhonda said. After Clem passed. "I kept meaning to." "Did you know him?" Rhonda nodded. "He knew my kids. I went through a rough stretch when they were small. Medical bills, behind on everything. Clem let me charge on account for 6 months. Said to pay when things cleared up." She paused. "When they cleared up, I tried to pay the full amount with interest. He said interest was for banks and he wasn't a bank. And the regular amount was fine. And then he said the regular amount was fine paid in half. I argued with him about it." "Did you win? You try winning an argument with Clem Broussard." Rhonda picked up her keys. "I've been thinking about this station for years. Glad it's open." She drove away. Delia watched the Subaru from the doorway. That evening she added Rhonda's name to the notebook. Not what Rhonda owed, what Rhonda carried. The particular weight of a kindness received that couldn't be fully repaid, that shaped you in ways you couldn't quite explain, that made you drive back to a gas station on a county road on a Tuesday afternoon just to say I was glad it's open. Clem had given a lot of people that weight. Delia was starting to understand it was a gift. The mid-story setback arrived on a Friday. A man from the county came with a clipboard and inspections forms. The underground fuel tanks hadn't been tested in 4 years. The permit to operate as a retail fuel station had lapsed when Clem died and hadn't been renewed because nobody had applied to renew it. The man was not unkind about it. He was doing his job. You can pump your own tanks for personal use, he said, but you can't sell retail fuel without the permit and a current tank certification. Delia looked at the clipboard. How long will the certification take? He thought. 3 to 4 weeks if you get the inspector out here fast. The permit itself processes in 10 business days after that. So 6 weeks minimum. He shrugged. Could be 8. Delia thanked him and watched him drive off. She stood in the lot. The pump island was locked again now, by law, which was where it had been when she arrived. She'd spent 6 weeks and every dollar from the lockbox and half the fuel contract advances getting them running, and now they were locked again, legally for 6 more weeks at minimum. She went inside and sat behind the counter for a while. Marcus came in from the bay and saw her face, and didn't say anything. He poured 2 coffees and set one in front of her. They drank without speaking. Outside, a truck slowed on Route C, looked at the locked pumps, and drove on. This is where a certain kind of person quit. Delia knew this because she'd watched Clem for enough summers to understand what staying looked like. Staying didn't mean it felt good. Staying meant you sat with the problem and drank your coffee and waited for the next thing to do to announce itself. She called the county inspector's office and scheduled the tank test for the earliest opening they had. She called the permit office and asked about the process. She called Patterson and asked if there was any acceleration available. Patterson said she'd look. Then she went back to work on what she could work on. The repair bay didn't need a permit. Cars still came in. Marcus was getting more competent every week. Norma spread the word that they were doing service work while the fuel permit processed, and the service work was enough to keep them operating if not comfortable. Enough was what Clem had always worked with. Enough was its own kind of sufficiency. Connie came for Thanksgiving. She drove down from Atlanta with her husband and their 2 girls, and they arrived on Wednesday afternoon with too much luggage and the particular energy of a family that had agreed to make the best of a situation they weren't sure about. The girls stood in the gravel lot and looked at the station and the river bottom and the cedar trees and the sky, which was big here in a way city skies weren't. Is this really where Great-Grandpa Clem worked? The older one asked. For 44 years, Delia said. It's small. Most important places are. Connie's husband offered to help with the firewood and Delia put him to work. The girls discovered the compass on the shelf and took turns holding it until Delia showed them how to read it standing in the lot and find true north. They stood very still with a compass between them, not speaking, which was its own kind of reverence. That night, after the girls were asleep on the apartment mattress and the men had gone out to walk the road, Connie sat with Delia behind the counter. The station was closed. The lamp by the register threw a yellow circle across the counter and caught the edge of Clem's tin mug. I sided with Ray, Connie said. She was looking at the counter. When you 2 were going through it, I sided with him because he seemed like the one who had it figured out. He always seemed like that. I know better now. Connie looked up. Mom, you look like yourself. I don't know if I've ever said that, but it's true. You look exactly like who you're supposed to be. Delia thought about Clem's letter, about the photograph he'd said was the best one he'd ever taken, the one of the 2 of them in front of the station when Delia was 6, before everything else. She went to the back room and came back with the cedar box. She took out the photograph envelopes and sorted through them until she found it. She'd known it was in there, but hadn't let herself look until now. There it was. Her at 6, standing in front of the station in overalls. Clem behind her, hand on her shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun. The sign above them freshly painted. The pumps shining. She'd been exactly who she was supposed to be then. She'd found her way back. Delia set the photograph on the counter beside the tin mug and the compass and the word search. The relic trio Clem had left exactly where they were. She didn't move them. She never moved them. They were Clem's accounting of something too precise for words. 6 months later, Broussard's Gas and Tires had been open long enough to matter. The pump island ran regular fuel and one grade of diesel, and the pump housings were still old, but they worked. The bay had 2 vehicles most days, and Marcus on 3. He'd passed his state mechanic certification in March first try, and Delia had closed the station for an afternoon and driven him to the testing center in Rolla and bought him lunch at a diner on the way back, and not said much, because some things were better let to sit in their own light. Norma still came mid-morning. She'd started bringing a second chair for the porch so she could stay longer. Gilbert brought corn from his field in August and wouldn't take money for it. Darryl, who'd fixed the roof, sent his nephew out with a car that needed a water pump. The nephew asked how much, and Marcus told him straight, and he said, "My uncle said to tell you this place is the real thing." Delia didn't know what to do with that. She wrote it in the notebook. On a Saturday in April, a bus pulled in off the highway, not the county bus, a Greyhound making a road stop. A woman got off with 2 children and a rolling bag that had a broken wheel. The woman looked at the lot, at the station, at the pumps, with the expression of someone calculating what they had left. Delia came out from behind the counter. "Trouble with the bag?" she asked. "Wheel broke in Joplin." The woman picked up the bag by its side handle. "We're trying to get to Cape Girardeau. Is there a mechanic? Come inside." Delia held the door. "We can't fix a wheel, but we've got coffee and my mechanic can look at what you've got." She got them situated on the porch stools. Coffee for the mother, soda for the kids from the cooler Delia had put in last week. Marcus came out of the bay, looked at the broken wheel housing on the bag, came back 10 minutes later with a piece of hardware from the parts bin and repaired it. He charged nothing, and when the woman tried to pay, he said he'd had a slow afternoon. He hadn't had a slow afternoon. The woman drove off on the afternoon bus connection, the bag whole again. Delia watched the bus go from the porch. Marcus leaned in the bay doorway behind her. "Your dad would have done the same thing?" "He would have." "Good." He went back to work. Delia went inside and behind the counter. She picked up Clem's compass from the shelf, felt the worn brass warm in her hand. She placed it back beside the word search, still open to the puzzle page. Beside the tin mug that still held 2 pencils and a tire gauge. The one word in the puzzle that Clem had circled but never crossed off the list. She looked at it. She picked up one of the pencils and crossed it off. She locked the front door at dusk with the key that had been Clem's, then his father's. The sign above the door threw its modest glow against the dark, hand-painted, weather-worn, lit, Broussard Gas and Tires. She climbed the stairs to the apartment that smelled like coffee and the cedar of the old building and the particular compound of oil and autumn that meant Ozarks, that meant home. She was 58 years old. She was just getting started. A place is just walls and a roof until someone decides it's worth keeping. Then it becomes something else entirely. It becomes proof. She hadn't argued when Ray's attorney said the station was worth $18,500. That was the thing she'd come to understand about herself over 31 years of marriage. She had developed a fluency in not arguing. It wasn't cowardice, though it looked like it from the outside. It was something more specific. A learned conviction that argument was not efficient, that whatever energy went into pushing back could be better spent elsewhere. That Ray's reading of a situation was usually more informed than hers because he worked in a world of numbers and numbers were real in a way that feelings weren't. She had believed this about herself for 3 decades. Sitting in the truck in the courthouse parking lot with $847 in her checking account and a deed to an abandoned gas station on a gravel road, she began to wonder when she'd started believing it and whether it had ever been true. Ray hadn't told her to stop arguing. He'd never said anything so direct. He'd had a way of listening to her opinions with a particular quality of attention that communicated without words that he was waiting for her to arrive at the same conclusion he'd already reached. He was patient about it. Patient in the way a teacher was patient with a bright student who kept almost getting it. And Delia had spent 31 years almost getting it. Arriving at his conclusions a beat behind him, grateful when she got there, she started the truck. The marriage had not been cruel. That was the thing that made it hard to explain to people who asked, which wasn't many people, because she hadn't told many people what it had felt like. Ray provided. Ray was present. Ray managed the finances with a rigor that Delia had admired and later understood as control, and later still recognized as a form of insurance against a world he found fundamentally unreliable. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He built things that lasted and protected what he'd built. He just hadn't believed that Delia was one of the things worth protecting. She hadn't understood this until she stopped having a reason to pretend she hadn't understood it. The road south felt different than it had in years. She drove without the radio, which was something she never did when Ray was in the car because Ray needed background audio the way some people needed background light. Always something playing. Always some voice filling the silence so the silence couldn't say anything he didn't want to hear. The silence said quite a lot now. She let it. She stopped at a gas station in Marshfield to fill the truck and sat in the lot for a few minutes eating a package of crackers she found in the glove box. The crackers were stale. She ate them anyway. She was 58 years old and eating stale crackers in a parking lot and had nowhere particular to be before dark, and none of this was what she'd expected her life to look like. She thought about what she'd expected. She'd expected the things she'd been building for 31 years. The stability. The house with the good furniture. The retirement account that would cover the winters in Florida they'd talked about. The life that justified the compromises. She wasn't going to get any of that. She pulled out of the lot and headed south. The Ozarks opened up around her as the highway dropped in elevation, the terrain shifting from the flat middle ground of the Springfield Plateau into the folded country of the river valleys. The cedars got denser. The road curves got tighter. She passed through towns small enough to have a grain elevator and a post office and a tavern and not much else. She passed a church with a handmade sign. She passed 3 trailers set back from the road with firewood stacked on their porches in long, neat rows. She recognized this landscape in a way she didn't recognize Springfield. Clem had brought her through here on car trips when she was young, driving slowly because he said fast was disrespectful to country you were traveling through for the first time, and you were always traveling through it for the first time if you paid attention. He'd pointed out the water gaps in the limestone bluffs where the creek ran through. He'd known the names of the trees. He'd pulled over once to look at a red-tailed hawk sitting on a fence post and hadn't started the car again until the hawk flew. She'd forgotten that memory. Or not forgotten it, stored it somewhere she hadn't gone. The gravel of Route C came under the tires and the sound of it was unmistakable. She recognized it before she could have said why. The particular crunch and scatter of loose gravel that was different from pavement in a way that went past the ears. She slowed and let herself arrive. The week after the permit suspension, Marcus took the truck into town and came back with a used laptop he'd bought from a pawn shop for $40. He set it on the counter and started reading about Missouri fuel tank inspection requirements. About the permitting timeline, about what interim operations were allowed under provisional status. Delia watched him from across the counter. He was reading the same way she'd watched Clem read a parts manual, with the focused, slightly forward-leaning posture of someone for whom information was not background noise but material. He took notes on a yellow legal pad he'd found in the stockroom. "You don't have to do that," Delia said. "I know." He turned a page. "There's a provisional operating status you can apply for. If you've got a pending certification and the tanks have been in the ground more than 10 years, allows limited retail fuel sales while the certification processes." He looked up. "Your tanks have been in the ground since 1979. How do you know that?" "Norma told me." She said Clem put them in himself with 2 men from the county. Said it took a week. Delia came around the counter and looked at the laptop screen. The provisional status application was 3 pages. It required documentation of the tank installation date, the pending certification order number, and a notarized statement from the property owner. Marcus had already printed the form. It sat next to the legal pad. "Norma said there might be records in the green filing cabinet," he said. "Under I for installation or under tanks?" There were records under T. A folder labeled Tanks, Underground, Installation, 1979, inside, the original specifications from the company that had supplied them, a hand-drawn diagram in Clem's block lettering showing the tank dimensions and placement, and, better than either, a receipt from the county environmental office dated October 14, 1979, stamped, paid, and signed. They had the documentation. The provisional status was approved in 11 days. The pumps opened again on a cold Wednesday morning. Marcus was the one who unlocked them. Delia watched from the station door. It wasn't a ceremony. Nobody gathered. A car pulled up 4 minutes later and a man filled his tank and left without knowing or caring what the unlocking had meant. But Delia stood in the doorway until the transaction was done and the man had driven away, and then she went inside and wrote in the notebook. November 16. Pumps open. 2 words. But they were the right 2 words, and they were true, and that was enough. The deeper work happened in the evenings after Marcus locked the bay and Norma had gone home, and the station was quiet in the way that Ozark's nights were quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a particular quality of stillness that city nights never had. Delia sat behind the counter and read Clem's ledger in order from the first entry to the last. It took 3 weeks of evenings. He'd helped 214 families in 44 years. She counted. She went back and counted again. 214 distinct entries, each one a name and a need and an act and sometimes a follow-up. The needs ranged from $12 for a car battery to $3,200 for a surgery. The acts ranged from 5 minutes of labor to 2 days of work on a seized tractor engine. The follow-ups were the thing that stayed with her. Clem noting, sometimes years later, that a child from a family he'd helped had gotten into college, or that the farm was still running, or that the woman whose transmission he'd fixed had married again and seemed happy. He'd cared whether they were happy. Not in a sentimental way. In the way of a man who planted something and wanted to know if it grew. On the last page of the ledger, after the final entry a notation from just before he died, a tank of gas for a woman who'd broken down on Route C in the rain, he had written one sentence in his compressed hand. "This is what I spent myself on. I don't regret it." She closed the ledger. She set it on the shelf beside the compass and the word search, and the tin mug. The relic quartet now. She didn't care that it broke the rule of 3. It was what was there and it was all his, and it was all true. Outside, the river bottom was deep in its winter quiet. Stars thick over the ridgeline. The sign above the door threw its careful glow across the gravel. She locked up and climbed the stairs. The apartment smelled like coffee and wood heat, and the particular cedar smell that came from old Missouri Ozarks buildings when the weather turned cold. A smell she had no word for but recognized as home in the way you recognized a voice you'd grown up hearing. She was 58 years old and she knew exactly what she was. She was Clem Broussard's daughter. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole thing. Spring brought the dogwood blossoms and the mud and the smell of the river rising in the bottoms, and with it a steadier current of vehicles on Route C. Delia started a coffee hour on Saturday mornings. 8 to 10, come if you want, no agenda. It had started by accident. 3 regulars had showed up at the same time one Saturday and sat on the porch in the cold with their mugs and talked about the weather and the road and the price of diesel, and then 2 more people had driven up and joined them, and by 9:30 there were 7 people on a porch built. For 4. She'd brought out the folding chairs Norma had left. The following Saturday there were 9. She didn't call it an event. She didn't advertise it. She made enough coffee and let it find its shape. Norma came every week. Hank Dawson had become Norma's friend from down the road. In this version of the story, a man named Darryl who'd fixed the roof. Darryl came when he wasn't farming. Gilbert came when the weather was dry. The retired teacher drove his 40 minutes each way and always brought something. A jar of honey, a bag of sweet potatoes, whatever was surplus. The elderly couple brought a checkerboard that stayed on the porch railing between visits. Delia learned to listen without filling the silences. Clem had been good at this. She'd watched him as a girl, standing behind the counter while a customer talked. And he'd had a quality of attention that wasn't waiting for his turn to speak, but genuine interest in the duration and direction of someone else's thinking. She practiced it. It was harder than it looked. The instinct to fill was strong. But when she held back, people said things they wouldn't have said to someone who was rushing them. They told her about their children and their worries and their dead. They told her about Clem and the particular way people told stories about someone who had mattered to them, with a careful detail of someone trying to get it exactly right. She wrote it in the notebook. Not to record it. To honor it. To say, this was said here and it was true, and it matters that it was said. Marcus noticed the notebook. "That's your dad's thing?" he asked one evening. "My version of it." He looked at it. He tracked the people. I'm tracking the conversations. He thought about this. So the same thing. She supposed it was. He'd enrolled in a 2-year technical program at the community college. He drove to class 3 evenings a week and came back late and didn't complain about the hours or the distance. He paid rent in the form of being there and reliable, which was the only currency Delia had asked for. He had no family to speak of, or none he spoke of, which was its own kind of information. He'd arrived with a cardboard suitcase and work boots that were too big, and he'd been building the rest of himself since. Delia watched it happen the way Clem had watched it happen in his ledger, with interest in the direction, with patience for the pace, with the quiet confidence that something was growing. She left things in his path without calling them gifts. A good ratchet set she found at an estate sale, already organized in a case. A pair of work boots that fit, left outside his door on a Tuesday morning. A copy of a diesel repair manual she'd ordered from a used bookstore, left on the counter with a note that said reference only in her handwriting, which was his cue that the note was a joke and the manual was his. He never thanked her for these things. He used them, which was better.